You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 69. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 69. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I am so delighted to be connecting with you this week. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you're new to the podcast, welcome. So nice to have you. This week, we are talking about confidence and how to rebuild your confidence when you have a setback. This is a topic that I think is so important. I think for lawyers at all levels, women lawyers, men lawyers, whatever stage you're at, the skill of rebuilding your confidence is one that will allow you to take your practice so much further and to have such a greater impact through your work. I think that anytime you're in a profession, whether it's the practice of law, the practice of medicine, whether you're coaching, entrepreneuring, whatever it is that you're doing, if you're in a line of work where you are constantly pushing yourself to the edges of your limits, where you're constantly learning new skills, where you are taking on additional responsibilities, you're constantly going to be growing and evolving. And every time you do that, you take on the opportunity to do more, to achieve more, to grow more, and it also increases the chances that there will be setbacks. Every time you step outside your comfort zone, you take that risk. And so one of the things I would love for you to take away from today's conversation is, number one, if you are experiencing a setback in your work, then chances are that setback is related to you pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone. And for that, I think you should be really proud of yourself. I know I'm proud of you. And part of the reason that I'm recording this episode is to help you navigate that rebuilding of your confidence so that you can continue to build and grow with greater ease and create more impact through your work. So with that, my friend, I welcome you to today's podcast. We're going to dive into rebuilding your confidence, and I'm going to offer you some strategies for how you can go about doing that. And as we get started, I would invite you to think about where you're at in your practice. Now, it may be that you're listening to this podcast episode because it just so happens to be the one that came out this week, or maybe we are having this conversation at some point in the future, which is quite frankly a really beautiful concept. And maybe you have been struggling with something in your practice. Maybe you've experienced a loss of confidence for one of the reasons that we're going to talk about, or something else that has happened in your practice. Maybe you're listening to this podcast episode and you're thinking back on some of the stages in your growth where you've really felt like you had lower confidence than where you would have liked it to be. And if this relates to you, then you're not alone. And I would invite you to think about how what we talk about today applies to you and how you can apply what we're talking about today in your own practice. So whether it's dealing with something that comes up in the future, or maybe it's something you're dealing with right now, maybe it's reframing the way that you think about a past situation where you felt like it was a setback, where you felt like you had a loss of confidence. Hopefully what we talk about today is going to help you navigate those situations in a way that makes it easier for you and allows you to really build on your resilience. So with that, we are going to dive in. I'm so glad to have you here today. And if this is a topic that strikes a chord with you, I'd love to hear from you. If it's something that I can help you with, you're more than welcome to reach out. We can schedule a consult. I can help you with that. So confidence and rebuilding your confidence. What does this look like in your practice? So I think that confidence is one of those things that can create a problem in your practice, particularly where you experience a loss of confidence, particularly in yourself. And this can come up in a number of ways. If you are practicing as a lawyer, there are going to be challenges in your job. Some of them are quite, I don't want to say obvious, but they're ones that will stand out to you as potentially causing you to have a loss of confidence. For example, if you make a mistake on a file. Now, if this happens to you, then of course you want to share that with somebody at your firm or organization who can help you deal with that, who can help you deal with insurers. It's not something that you want to deal with on your own. There's that aspect of it. But in addition to that, there's that feeling of confidence, right? That you may feel like others don't see you in the same light that they saw you before. You may not see yourself in that same light. So making a mistake on a file in relation to your legal work may, for you, cause a dip in your confidence. And that may be a situation where you want to take steps to rebuild it. Another example might be where something goes wrong on a file, not necessarily even wrong from a mistake perspective, but you don't get the outcome that you wanted. Maybe you're representing a client, you're running a trial, an application, a negotiation, you're trying to stitch together a deal, and something just doesn't work out. And as a result, you feel like you didn't do the best job, the client didn't get the result they wanted, and you take that on as your fault. And so that might cause you to question your skills as a lawyer. Is this the work that you're meant to be doing? Would somebody else have done this better, faster? Whatever those thoughts might be, that might be another situation. And so maybe that's something that you can relate to as you're thinking about times in your professional life and even outside of your professional life where you feel like your confidence has suffered or been bruised. Another example is when you lose your job. And this experience of losing your job is one where you may feel like there is a loss of confidence, that you have been rejected or for whatever reason you haven't been kept on. And that can really go to our core as professionals, what that can feel like, even if it wasn't a job that was a good fit for you, even if you knew that it was coming, even if you didn't want to be there. Still, if somebody else makes that decision for you, that can also really serve to undermine the way that you see yourself. And finally, another example that I think is important to consider is what happens when you are in a culture, a working environment that is ill-suited to you. I venture to say a toxic work culture, but that to me is really extreme. So a toxic work culture would be almost one where it's abusive, where people are really not treating each other respectfully. And that may be a situation that you find yourself in. But even if your work culture isn't quite toxic, but it's not supportive, if the lawyers that you work with, the clients that you work with, undermine your confidence in the way that they speak to you, if there's a lack of respect, if you feel like there are unrealistic expectations, over time, that can also serve to undermine your confidence in the way that you see yourself. Now, before we move on, I just wanted to highlight that there are some other areas where you may feel like you lack confidence that are completely counterintuitive. And that is when you reach a new plateau. It's, for example, when you get promoted to partner, or you go to the bench, or you are being promoted in some other way, or you're on the verge of a great success, right? You know it's about to happen. And instead of feeling excited and proud and confident, you feel the opposite. It's like that imposter syndrome kicks in, and all of a sudden you're asking yourself how you got here. This is not sustainable. If people really knew what I was all about, they would not think I was deserving of this position. So that might be another area you might want to explore when it comes to confidence and building up your confidence. Now, for today, we're really going to focus on the setbacks because that's an area that I really want to focus on today. What you do when there's a failure or a mistake or not meeting expectations. How do you deal with that when your confidence feels like it's just sunk? And for anybody who's been there, I know I've been there. I know clients I've worked with have been there. Lawyers I know professionally, they've been there. This is not uncommon. And the question here is, how do you recover from that? So why is this a problem? Well, I think the reason that lawyers and other high achievers in particular find it so challenging to recover after a setback is that you are so used to excelling. I'm guessing that if you're listening to this podcast, you have been told from a very early stage, maybe as early as kindergarten, that you're a great student, you're a straight A student, you are a good girl maybe, and things tend to come naturally for you. And so the idea of taking more time to learn how to do something might feel like there's something wrong, right? If it doesn't come easily and naturally to you, then it must be a sign that there's something wrong. So I think when you then put yourself out in the professional context and you're really stretching yourself, you're taking on risks, you're challenging yourself in ways that are uncomfortable, whether it's going to court, whether it's taking on super complex files, whether it's dealing with clients who are sophisticated and who are asking you really difficult questions, and you're trying to figure out how best to serve them. There are all these areas where you're now being pushed out of your comfort zone. And instead of giving yourself that grace of evolving and learning over time, it's like you want to be there already, but you just don't have that experience. So there's that gap between where you expect yourself to be, where you want to be, and where you are. And the only way to get through that is to learn. And sometimes that's going to involve learning and not necessarily meeting the expectations that you set for yourself, i.e., it might be a setback. Another way that this can come up in the context of your professional work is that you may find that as your path has evolved, as you've moved from kindergarten, really starting at the beginning, through high school, through university, through law school, through the initial stages of your job to where you are now, the colleagues that you surround yourself with are of increasingly high performance. And what that does is that you are now shoulder to shoulder with these super high performers. And so instead of seeing yourself as being one of them, a super high performer along with them, you may start measuring yourself against them and seeing only the gaps. And so that might feel like you're underperforming when actually you aren't underperforming. It's just that you are surrounded by such high performers, such high achievers, that it feels that way to you. And in that environment, if and when you have a setback, you might take on that disappointment at an even greater scale because you look around you and you think to yourself, well, nobody else has had that setback. There must be something wrong with the way that I'm doing things. So that's another area where it can come up. Another thing that I see often among the lawyers that I work with, lawyers that I know professionally, that I speak with, is this idea of perfectionism. And that is something that I think runs deep in the legal culture of wanting everything to be perfect, of having really high expectations of our own integrity, of the work that we do, of the emails that we send, the papers that we draft. If there's anything wrong, then it really feels like a major, major flaw. And so that might be another area where you find you've got these really high expectations, particularly of yourself. And those expectations are so high, they reach a point of being unrealistic. And when you measure yourself against that unrealistic standard, you can't help but always fall short. And so that may be another way in which you're undermining your confidence, particularly if you find yourself then making a mistake or losing your position or not getting the promotion that you were seeking or having something happen on a file that isn't perfect, isn't according to plan. You might take that even harder than others would. And there might be a number of ways that you try to deal with this. And I know that you're super smart and capable and you've dealt with setbacks before. So likely you have your own strategies, and whatever those strategies are that are working, I would invite you to hold onto them and to build on them. But I also see sometimes that we try to use strategies that don't necessarily help. So some of those strategies might be seeking validation from others. And if you're doing this, I totally get it. And it's human, right? When something bad happens to us, when we perceive ourselves as having failed at something or made a mistake or had a setback, often what we want is reassurance from others that we are good people, that we are a good lawyer, that we are not inherently flawed. And so that might be one of the strategies that you go to, that something happens. And so you look outside yourself, you go to others, whether it's colleagues, family members, friends, to seek that validation. Maybe you're seeking permission, right? Maybe you are in a position that you really don't want to be in. You've now had a setback. It's only further proof to you that you're in the wrong place. You don't want to be there, but you don't want to admit to yourself that it's not the right place for you. You might be seeking permission from somebody else to leave that situation. And if you're doing that, you are not alone. Another example might be where you are complaining, right? Another instinct when something goes wrong is to find a sympathetic ear and vent, right? Who doesn't like venting sometime, right? Not that you need to vent all the time, but the trouble with venting is that it's not actually going to resolve the problem. And I'll get to that more in a minute, but what I want to highlight here is that venting puts you into that victim mentality. It's saying something outside of me, whether it's a person who did something or a situation in the world, that was what caused this whole thing to unravel. And I will tell you, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, that it's very disempowering to take responsibility and place it in the hands of somebody else, because then you are an ineffective agent in that situation. You no longer feel like you have any sense of control. Other strategies that you might use is maybe you try to overwork. So let's say you're working in an environment and you make a mistake and you feel like others don't fully appreciate you. They don't value you. They don't see you as a good lawyer. You may try to overcompensate for that by overworking, overcommitting. Maybe you work in an environment where it is this borderline toxic culture where the expectations of others are borderline unrealistic. And so you find yourself trying to people please all of the time or be fixing things all of the time so that there are no mistakes, so that you never have to deal with the discomfort of things not being utterly perfect. And you can do that, of course, but then the result of that can be that you reach a point of unsustainability that can lead to burnout. Another strategy that you might use, and it's not one that you maybe use at a conscious level, but it's this idea of negative self-talk and kind of beating yourself up. So you might find that you make a mistake and you kind of anticipate the worst, and then you berate yourself. You tell yourself it was a really ridiculous mistake, that nobody else would ever do something so ridiculous and it's your fault and you were being careless, whatever it is that you say to yourself. And part of that might be because you believe that if you're hard on yourself, then number one, you've prepared yourself. There's nothing anybody else can say that would be worse than what you are telling yourself. And also you might believe that that's going to motivate you to do better next time. So these are some of the examples of how you might be trying to deal with a situation where something has gone wrong. You've experienced a setback. Your confidence feels low. And so this is how you try to deal with it. But ultimately, it doesn't work. You might find that you get some short-term benefit, but long run, it doesn't solve the problem. If you look to others for validation, for example, you're never really learning how to do that for yourself, and you're always putting somebody else as a middleman in that equation. So how do you validate yourself if you're relying on somebody else to accept you or give you permission? Then if that person or those people stop doing that, then you're back where you started. You don't have that internal sense of confidence to fall back on. It also doesn't fix anything. You may be in a situation where something goes wrong and you go and talk to a friend and they say, oh, don't worry about it. Everything's fine. And you think, great, everything's fine. And so you don't feel that same need to go back and analyze the situation, what happened and how you might learn from it. And so you run the risk that nothing really gets resolved and that you fall into the same trap on repeat. Similarly, as we were talking about with that notion of going and complaining and venting and being the victim, that doesn't solve anything either, because as long as you're blaming somebody else and you're taking that victim role, then you don't get to experience the accountability. You don't get to see yourself as a responsible agent. You effectively give your power away. And that feels really unsettling because you feel like there's nothing you can do about it, when in fact, there probably are steps that you can take that would help resolve the problem and be more empowering for you. You might try to solve the problem by taking on a new environment. So for example, by taking on a new job. If you are let go, or if you find that the working conditions that you have are not sustainable for you, you might go somewhere else. And in some cases, that is absolutely the right thing for you to do. But I must mention that if that's what you choose to do, I strongly encourage you to figure out what the problems were in that previous environment so that you don't take those same problems with you. So to give you an example, you might find that one of the problems that you have in one organization is that you tend to people please, that you go over the top, that you put yourself at risk, whether it's your health, whether it's completely overextending yourself. You want to please others. And so you bend yourself into a pretzel to do that to your detriment. And if you take that with you, you might start out in a new environment where the expectations aren't that you're going to be a people pleaser, but you start to create that expectation. And then you basically recreate a situation that was untenable for you in your new environment. So think about how that might apply to you, what you might be doing in one environment that you would not want to bring with you into the next environment, because that's really where you have leverage to change what you're doing and to have an ongoing, lasting impact when you move into that new environment. Similarly, we talked about that idea of fixing things, right? If you're always trying to fix things and make sure that nobody is unhappy, that's a really tough way for you to create a sustainable sense of self-confidence, because again, when something goes wrong, and maybe you'll take that on as something that is inherently you, that you have created that, or if people around you aren't happy, then instead of being able to have the confidence to stand up to that, maybe it's setting boundaries, maybe it's holding your ground in an argument or a discussion about something that really is important to you, where you have strong views. If that isn't strong, then you may find that you're not able to sustain that level of confidence. So these are ways in which I'm inviting you to think about how strategies that might work short term aren't necessarily the strategies that are going to work long term. Another example is overworking. And so if you're trying to, again, just burn the candle at both ends in order to make things work, to make things manageable, in order not to have to do certain things like set boundaries, like set no, like admit that you can't do it all, then the result of that can be that you overextend yourself, and it can lead to burnout or maybe poor work quality. And so again, you're not actually fixing the problem of dealing with that sense of self-concept, that sense of self-confidence, and it leaves you vulnerable to situations that come up outside of you. It leaves you vulnerable to setbacks. So what you ultimately create with that approach is somewhat of a vicious cycle where you can build up your confidence for a time, and you might enjoy that. But when something goes wrong, when you experience a setback, then you feel like your confidence is once again struck down, and you have to start all over again at the beginning. So what I want to share with you today are some strategies to help you develop a more consistent approach to your confidence, a way of dealing with setbacks, so that when they happen, it gets easier for you to rebuild your confidence more quickly, so that you can go out and do your work in the world, so that you can create the impact that I know that you can create. So what is it that I suggest? I've got 6 ideas here, and I'm going to take you through those. The first is to adopt a growth mindset. And if you've followed this podcast, then you've heard me likely talk about growth mindset before. It's a concept that was coined by Carol Dweck. She's an American psychologist, and it's distinguished from a fixed mindset. A fixed mindset is one that is often associated with perfectionism. It is the idea that your intelligence is fixed, and if you go to do something hard, challenging, and it doesn't work out, that is a sign that you are somehow deficient, not smart, and that you shouldn't do it, right? It's a deficiency on your part. Versus a growth mindset. A growth mindset it stems from the concept that if something is hard and challenging, that it means that you are growing. And I should take one step back, actually. A growth mindset is premised on the idea that our intelligence is not fixed, that we are capable of becoming more intelligent. And this concept is consistent with the most recent research on neuroplasticity, which supports the idea that your brain is plastic, and the more you do certain things, the better you become at them. And with persistent effort and action, you can actually increase your brain's capacity to do certain things. So in this case, we're taking that growth mindset and saying, okay, if there's something that I'm trying to do and it's new and it's hard and it's challenging, the fact that you find it hard and challenging isn't a sign that there's anything wrong with you. It is simply a sign that you are doing something that is helping you grow, that is helping your brain get stronger. So when you take that approach, the growth mindset approach, all of a sudden, when you have a setback, it's not a sign that you're a failure or that something has gone terribly wrong. No, rather, it's a sign that you have tried to push yourself outside your comfort zone. It's a sign that you are learning and that this is a good thing, that ultimately this is going to make you smarter and stronger. So that's tip number 1, is to adopt a growth mindset. Now, tip number 2 is to accept that there will be setbacks in your career. And anytime that you are in a career, as I was mentioning earlier, where you are required to push yourself, whether you're practicing law, practicing medicine, some other discipline where you are constantly on your growing edge. In law, the laws are changing. The procedures that you are doing become more complex as you advance. You are taking on more responsibility, more complicated files. You go from being a junior member on a team to leading a team. You go from reporting to the client sometimes to being that client's trusted advisor. There's a lot of responsibility and growth that will happen over the course of your career. And as you grow from one stage to the next, there will be times when you have setbacks. And so if you can accept that the price that you're going to pay for that growth is that there will be setbacks, then you can process them a little bit more easily because it's not defying your expectation of what your career is going to be. It's more aligned with the expectation that as much as you're growing, you're also going to run up against challenges and that is okay. So what you can decide there is that you don't want those setbacks to define you as a professional. Rather, how I would approach that is to let how you deal with those setbacks be what defines you. So that's number 2, is to accept that you're going to have setbacks. Number 3 is to accept that you're not always going to feel confident. Now, this is a concept that I talk about in an earlier podcast episode. It's called What to Do When You Don't Feel Confident Yet, and I'll link to it in the show notes. Basically, the concept here is that even if you are a very confident person, a very confident lawyer, there will be days where you experience self-doubt or imposter syndrome or whatever it is that might plague you, and that is perfectly okay. Again, the idea here isn't that you're never going to feel a lack of confidence, but rather, how are you going to deal with it when it happens? And when you accept that and you learn from that and you are kind to yourself and you use it as an opportunity to grow and to learn, you'll have a very different outcome than you would if you were to allow that lack of confidence to stop you from doing what you're doing, from growing, from learning. So just to summarize, the first 3 suggestions are: number 1, to have a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Number 2, to accept that you will have setbacks. As long as your career is pushing you to grow, you will have setbacks. And number 3, you are not going to feel confident all of the time. And I can think of very senior, seasoned, successful lawyers who have talked about having those moments, right? Where they don't win the case, or they have something happen with a client where things go wrong. They make a mistake and they have that momentary lapse of feeling like that momentary loss of confidence. But the trick is to learn from it and move on, which brings us to our next point, which is number 4, which is to take a close look at your failures. So anytime you have a failure, and I use this term with air quotes because I really hesitate over such thing as failure truly exists. I think failure is defined as unmet expectations. And what we can take from failure is that you tried something and it did not meet your expectations. What you choose to make of it is up to you. And in this case, what I recommend doing is to evaluate the failures that you have so that you don't make the same mistakes twice and you can learn from them. So it starts with asking yourself, what went right? For every situation, I'm sure there are aspects to how things unfolded where you look back and say, okay, no, this was actually exactly what we needed to do in that moment. This was a good decision. These were good actions. You can go back and give yourself a list. What went right? And then you want to ask yourself, what went wrong? And again, you want to spend some time with that and evaluate it as objectively as possible and make a list and figure out where is it that you went wrong. And chances are what you'll find is that in making that list, there will be elements to it that were outside of your control, and there will be other elements that were inside of your control. And I'd invite you to think about how those elements that are inside of your control are actually empowering, because now you're getting clues. You're getting a recipe of how you can improve moving forward. And that brings us to the next question, which is, what will you do differently next time? So once you've looked at what you've done well, you've looked at where you think you made a mistake or wouldn't do it the same again, then you get to decide, how am I going to approach this differently next time? And what that does is it provides you with a roadmap for strategies going forward. Now, the next thing I would recommend when you're trying to rebuild your confidence after a setback is to ask yourself empowering questions. Now, I think a lot of us tend to default to questions that are not empowering at all. So maybe you make a mistake, or maybe it's a typo, right? You send out an email and there's a typo and you think, why do I always send out emails with typos? And you'll answer that question. Well, because you're careless and you never double check your writing, or you don't see them because your eyesight isn't very good, whatever it happens to be. If you ask yourself a question like that, you're going to get an answer that points out to you all the things that you're doing wrong. And that really isn't a very empowering place to be, and it doesn't help you move forward. It doesn't build your confidence, that's for sure. So what kind of questions would be more empowering? Well, number one, questions that encourage you to take responsibility are empowering. So one question might be, how am I 100% responsible for this outcome? Now, it may be that the outcome is not 100% your responsibility. But what if you were to take 100% responsibility? Then what? And what you'll find is that as you answer that question, it's actually really empowering, because now you see how you could affect change going forward with your own actions. Another question that you might ask yourself is, how does this setback make me a better lawyer? So what comes up for you if you have a setback? If you have a court application, for example, it doesn't go the way you wanted, you feel pretty down about it, but then you ask yourself, how does this make me a better lawyer? From that question, you might start to tease out the lessons that you learned, things that you would apply going forward, how you're going to be that much stronger and more able the next time you speak to a similar application. The third question is, how is this the best thing that could have happened? So if you, for example, are let go from your job, it might be really hard for you to ask yourself this question in the very immediate aftermath. But if you give yourself a little bit of time, you might start to see how it truly is the best thing that could have happened for you. Often what I see is that when people are let go from positions and organizations, often it wasn't a very good fit. And the person who is let go then goes on to find something that is so much better suited for them, an environment that is better suited, doing work that is better suited. And so if that's something that you've experienced, you might ask, how is this the best thing that has ever happened or that could have happened? And this applies to other situations as well. Maybe there are mistakes or other setbacks where it's really hard to see at the time. But if you give yourself a bit of breathing space, you can start to understand how it is the best thing. Maybe something goes wrong in a file, a typo or a missing document or something, and you realize that by discovering that error at that stage, you've actually saved yourself from a much larger error down the road. So once you start asking yourself that question, you'll start to see how it's the best thing that could have happened. Now, another empowering question along those same lines is, if you can't really see what makes that situation the best thing that could have happened, another way to ask that question is, how do I make this the best thing that ever happened to me? And that question is even more empowering because it now puts you in that action state where you start to think of what steps you can take today or in the future that will make that situation the best thing. So ask yourself that and see what kind of questions come to mind or what sort of answers come to mind for you. Another question is, in what ways do I need to forgive myself? And I think this question is empowering because sometimes we can spend a lot of time perseverating and beating ourselves up, thinking we've done something terribly wrong. And the truth is that conversation lives only in your mind. The rest of the world, chances are they've moved on. And what I would invite you to do is to give yourself the grace to move on also. And one way that you can do that is to identify what it is that you're harboring against yourself. What are the beliefs that you have about what you should have done differently, how you somehow were in error? Can you forgive yourself for that? And then can you move on from there? And then finally, the last question that I would encourage you to ask yourself is one that relates to seeking external validation. So when you're out shopping around for validation or permission, understanding, empathy, whatever it is that you're wanting from somebody else, what if you gave that to yourself? And the follow-on question there in my mind is, what would I do if I had permission? What would I do if I felt validated? And that gets you into that next level where you're now making your decisions based on a sense of wholeness, where you feel validated, you feel like you've got permission to do what you need to do, you feel understood, you feel heard, and then what? Where do you go from there? So that was number 5. And just to recap, the suggestions I have for you are: number 1 is to adopt a growth mindset. Number 2, accept that you will have setbacks. Number 3, accept that you are not always going to feel confident. Number 4, take a close look at your failures. In other words, what went right? What went wrong? What will you do differently next time? Number 5, ask yourself empowering questions. So how am I 100% responsible for the outcome? How does this setback make me a better lawyer? How is this the best thing that could have happened? How do I make this the best thing that could have happened? In what ways do I need to forgive myself? And can you give yourself the permission, validation, understanding, or empathy that you are seeking? And when you have that, what will be your next step? And finally, step number 6 is to put yourself in an environment that supports your confidence. So I mentioned earlier that the idea of jumping from one job to the next likely isn't the fix if what you feel is a loss of confidence. But as you take the other step, so you're rebuilding your confidence from within, it may be required that you surround yourself with people in an environment that is supportive of your growth. And what I've witnessed around me is that there are lawyers who really struggled in one setting, and when they stepped into a fresh setting, they thrived. And so I would invite you to think about who in your professional circle, who in your personal life supports you in a way that empowers you, that helps you feel confident and take action from that decisive and confident place, because that is where you're going to want to put yourself long term. Now, when you take these steps, they will create more lasting and sustainable confidence for you, because you will let go of unrealistic expectations. You will give yourself a chance to learn and to grow. You will stop judging yourself so harshly. You will stop relying on other people to give you that sense of confidence. And you will develop the skill of building your own confidence, which will in turn make you more resilient and able to navigate setbacks more adeptly. What you will need to develop these skills is a willingness to let go of the fantasy of perfection. If you are constantly comparing yourself to this ideal that doesn't exist, you will never be able to feel truly confident. So you can let that go. You will also need to let go of the story where you are a victim, where you are not confident. And in some ways, it can be scary if you let go of that victim story, because then all of a sudden, as long as you see yourself as a victim, you don't need to do the hard things. And once you decide to let that go and you decide to step into your confidence, you will then have to do the hard things. And I recorded a podcast episode about this recently. It's all about why you must close the confidence gap. And ultimately, the reason is that if you felt 100% confident, you would be doing so much more than you're doing. You may already be doing all these things, but for most of us, we're not really feeling our sense of 100% confidence. Maybe you're at the 90%, maybe you're at the 50%. It really depends on what stage you're at and how you feel about your own confidence levels. But I know for myself and for the clients that I've worked with, when your confidence isn't 100%, you can kind of talk yourself out of doing certain things that you know would create a huge impact in your professional work. So when you step into that confidence and you let go of that victim mentality, all of a sudden, those scary things that will create real results for you and for the people you serve, they become an option. And so that can be really scary. Now, the third thing that you'll need to do is to develop that muscle of self-trust. So you may have learned to put other people's judgment ahead of your own. You might think that other people are a better authority in your own life than you are. That's kind of how school is. If you think about it, they set the curriculum, they assign the grades. So you are looking to others to validate you. And what I'm encouraging you to do is to turn that around and to start looking within, to develop that sense of self-trust so that you know when you are doing a job that is in alignment with your standards and that you can develop that confidence from within yourself. When you apply these strategies, what you'll find is that you become better able to bounce back after setbacks. You will increase your resilience. As a result, you'll feel more confident. Your confidence will grow and continue to grow. And from there, you will feel more at peace. You'll be able to make decisions from that place of confidence. So if it's boundary setting, if it's decisions that you're making on a file, if it's the way that you communicate with your clients, all of that will come from this place of self-assuredness, that place of self-trust. And you will know that regardless of what happens, if there's pushback, if there are setbacks, that you will be able to manage that. You'll be able to handle the situation, and you'll also be able to rebuild your confidence if you feel like there's a loss of it. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention here for anybody who is struggling with this or who has struggled with this in the past is that I've offered some steps that will help you to rebuild your confidence. And in some cases, you might find that you're able to bounce back quite quickly. And sometimes there are events that happen, whether in your personal life, whether in your practice, and it can feel like it takes a long time to work through those challenges and to rebuild your confidence after the fact. And if that's something that you struggle with, I just want to let you know that you are not alone. And if I can help you in any way, I would invite you to reach out to me. I would love to hear from you, whether it's on LinkedIn, whether it's by email. If confidence and rebuilding your confidence is something that you'd like some help with, maybe it's along with achieving a next goal, a next milestone, by all means, please feel free to reach out. That's exactly what I love helping my clients with, and I would love to help you as well. So with that, my friend, I'm going to thank you for joining me this week. It has been a pleasure as always. I love having this opportunity to connect with you. And if you enjoyed the podcast, then please share it with anyone who you think would also enjoy the podcast. If you feel so inclined, I'd encourage you to leave me a rating and a review wherever it is that you listen to your podcast, because it helps other people find the podcast. So with that, my friend, thank you again. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll look forward to reconnecting with you again very soon. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.